There are machines in this world that do not merely move freight from one place to another. They carry something far heavier than any load they were ever rated for, something that cannot be weighed on any scale or measured in any unit that engineers have ever devised, and that something is the weight of legend, the weight of history, the weight of every mile driven and every hardship endured and every driver who ever climbed behind the wheel and pointed the nose of their rigger to rigger turned, and retrieve whoever climbed behind the wheel and pointed the nose of their rigger to throw it at, and it possibly far away and drove its weight. We're talking today about the Kenworth truck, not just any truck, not just any brand, but the Kenworth, a name that has been synonymous with heavy haulage excellence for nearly a century, a name that has been painted on the doors of more legendary rigs, driven by more legendary drivers across more legendary roads than almost any other name in the history of road transport anywhere in the world. And today, right here in Australia, in the red dirt and the burning sun, and the vast empty distances of this extraordinary country that has always known how to put a working machine through its paces, we found one of these legends sitting abandoned and forgotten, rusted and broken and apparently beyond saving, and we made the decision that most people would have considered insane. We decided to bring it back. Watu watu away from over the day gap. Watu are kubar bribe copper jam. I to what if Ryan told Brafter but to am over baby martyrs totally to 7. I to what if I'm with what you are both there what by Cooper's equation. So stopping jaw-dropping finishmation that you see on the right-hand side of this thumbnail, and I promise you that the journey between those two images, between that rusted broken windscreen screen fast, rusted retrocken windscreen smashed, was true to wearable. Aki wendobo, etwe vekebe boat dest. Was at the resonant, took a vevodio, at windaway, and reduquent, right was to what I cut. Before we get into the work itself, let us spend a few minutes understanding what a Kenworth actually is, and why finding one sitting abandoned in the Australian outback is the kind of thing that makes a restoration specialist's heart beat faster in a way that no other discovery quite manages to replicate. Kenworth Truck Company was founded in 1923 in Seattle, Washington, and from the very beginning it operated on a philosophy that was different from every other truck manufacturer of the era. The philosophy that a truck should be built to the specific requirements of the customer who was going to operate it, not mass-produced to a generic standard and sold to whoever happened to walk through the door. This commitment to custom engineering and exceptional quality became the DNA of the brand, and it produced trucks that were not merely good, they were exceptional. Trucks that drivers trusted with their lives and their livelihoods on roads and in conditions that would have destroyed machines built to a lesser standard. Kenworth trucks came to Australia in significant numbers from the 1960s onward, and they found in this country a landscape and a set of operating conditions that seemed almost designed to prove everything the brand claimed about itself. The Australian outback, the vast empty, brutally hot, occasionally flooded, perpetually demanding interior of this continent, is one of the harshest operating environments for heavy vehicles anywhere on Earth. The distances are staggering. The roads range from sealed highways to little more than dirt tracks to empty scrub. The temperatures swing from freezing overnight to 45 degrees in the shade during the day. The loads are enormous and the schedules are punishing, and the nearest mechanic might be 400 kilometers away if something goes wrong in the middle of the night in the middle of nowhere. In that environment, you need a truck that is not just good, you need a truck that is extraordinary, and that is exactly what the Kenworth delivered, which is why it became, over the decades, not just the preferred choice of serious Australian transport operators, but something approaching a cultural icon, a symbol of the grit and the determination and the vast ambition of Australian road transport that punched far above its weight on the world stage. The truck we found for this project was a late 1970s Kenworth Cabover, the classic configuration that dominated Australian heavy haulage in that era, with the cab sitting directly over the engine in a design that maximized the load-carrying length of the combination within the legal overall length limits of Australian roads. She had been sitting in the outback for what appeared to be at least 2 decades, possibly longer, in the kind of condition that accumulates when a machine that was built to work is instead left to stand still in one of the harshest climates on Earth. The windscreen was smashed, not cracked, not chipped, but completely destroyed. The safety glass crazed and collapsed inward, the rubber seal black and crumbling. The paintwork was gone, replaced across most of the surface area with a mixture of deep, textured rust and the ghost of what had once been paint, the color barely visible beneath the corrosion that had taken over every panel. The chrome, and there had been a great deal of chrome on this truck when she was new. The stacks and the bumpers and the sun visor and the grille surround was either gone or so badly pitted and corroded that it bore no resemblance to the mirror-bright metal it had once been. The tires were flat and cracked, the rubber perished by years of ultraviolet exposure and temperature extremes. The interior was a disaster of cracked and collapsed vinyl, rusted metal, shattered instruments, and the inevitable debris that accumulates inside any abandoned vehicle that has been sitting open to the elements and the wildlife of the Australian bush for 20 or more years. The engine, when we tried to assess it, was lock solid with corrosion. We could not turn it over by hand, and we could not determine the state of the internal components without stripping it down, which meant we were buying a very large and very uncertain number of unknown problems, along with the visible and catalogable ones. But here is the thing about Kenworth. Here is the thing that made us look at this machine and see not a pile of rusted scrap, but a sleeping giant waiting to be woken up. The structural integrity of the cab was sound. Underneath all the rust and the neglect and the decades of exposure, the bones of this truck were telling a story of engineering quality that the years had been unable to fully erase. The frame rails were solid. The cab structure, despite the surface corrosion, had not lost its geometric integrity, and the engine, though locked, was when we finally got it assessed by our engine builder, a candidate for a full rebuild rather than a lost cause. That assessment was the green light we needed, and from that point forward, there was no going back. The full assessment process on a truck of this size and complexity is a significant undertaking in itself, and we approach it with the kind of systematic thoroughness that the job demands. Every system is assessed individually: the drivetrain, the suspension, the braking system, the steering, the electrical system, the cab structure, the sleeper unit, the ancillary systems, and the findings are documented and costed before any commitment is made to proceeding. On this Kenworth, the assessment took the better part of a week, and what emerged from that process was a restoration scope that was, frankly, enormous. Every fluid system needed complete rebuilding. The entire electrical system needed to be stripped out and replaced from scratch. The cab would need extensive metalwork before it could be prepared for paint. The chrome would need to be completely renewed. The interior would need to be gutted and rebuilt from bare metal. The drivetrain would need a ground-up rebuild. The suspension and steering and braking systems would all need complete overhauls. In short, there was not a single system on this truck that could be left alone. Everything needed attention, and most things needed to be rebuilt or replaced entirely. The chassis work came first, as it always does, because on a truck of this class, the chassis is the foundation of everything else, and it needs to be sorted before any other work can proceed. The frame rails on a Kenworth of this era are massive steel sections that are built to handle payload weights that would buckle lesser structures, and on this truck they had survived the decades in better condition than we had initially feared. There was surface rust across the entire length of both rails, and there were areas of more serious corrosion around some of the cross-member connections and suspension mounting points, but the underlying metal was sound and the structural integrity was intact. We cleaned the rails back to bare metal using a combination of wire brushing and chemical treatment, addressed the areas of deeper rust with weld repair when necessary, and then applied a multi-stage protection system, etching, primer, sealer, and a top coat of the heavy-duty chassis paint that would protect the steel from future corrosion for many decades to come. The course members were inspected and treated individually. The fifth wheel mounting was checked and found to be in good condition. The air brake reservoirs were removed, inspected internally for corrosion, and replaced where the internal condition was not acceptable. New air lines were run throughout the chassis, replacing the original lines that had perished and cracked with age. The landing legs on the trailer coupling area were serviced and found to be operational. By the time the chassis work was complete, the frame of this old Kenworth looked like it belonged on a truck that had just come out of the factory, clean and correctly colored and protected for another half-century of hard work. The engine removal and rebuild was the heart of the mechanical restoration, and it was the part of the process that carried the most uncertainty going in and delivered the most satisfaction coming out. The engine in this truck is a classic American diesel, of the type that powered Australian heavy haulage to the late 1970s and into the 1980s. A large displacement, relatively low revening, enormous torque unit built on principles of simplicity and robustness that have kept examples of this engine type running reliably for 50 years and more in the hands of operators who know how to maintain them. Getting it out of the cab over configuration is a significant operation that requires the cab to be tilted. One of the advantages of the cab over design is the access it provides to the engine when the cab is forward tilted, and this feature made the engine extraction considerably more straightforward than it would have been on a conventional configuration truck. Once the engine was on the bench, our engine builder went through it with the kind of methodical thoroughness that a unit of this value and significance demands. What he found was both better and worse than we had hoped. Better because the block itself was not cracked, and the main bearing journals on the crankshaft were within the limits that allow for regrinding rather than replacement. Expensive news compared to the alternative of sourcing a replacement crankshaft for an engine of this vintage, which would have been a significant exercise in itself. Worse because the liner and piston condition was poor, with corrosion scoring on several liners that necessitated complete replacement rather than honing, and because the injection system was going to need complete rebuilding from the pump outward, with new injectors throughout and a pump rebuild that required specialist attention from an injection specialist who still understood the mechanical injection systems of this era. The head was sent away for full reconditioning, valve seats recut and inserts fitted where necessary. Valve guides replaced throughout. The head surface machined flat after checking for cracks with magnetic particle inspection. New valves, new springs, new stem seals, and the head came back looking like a new component. The block was bored and fitted with new liners, new pistons, and new rings. New main bearings and big end bearings were fitted throughout. The oil pump was replaced with a new unit. New core plugs were fitted throughout, new gaskets, new seals, new O-rings at every location where the originals had been. When the engine came back together on the bench, it was tight and fresh and correct. And when it was lifted back into the chassis and connected to all its systems and fired for the first time, it started cleanly and settled into the kind of authoritative, ground-shaking idle that only a large displacement diesel can produce. A sound that resonated through the floor of the workshop and announced to everyone present that this old Kenworth was alive again. The gearbox on this truck is a classic heavy-duty manual transmission of the type that was standard equipment on Australian highway trucks of this era, a multi-speed unit with a splitter that gives the driver a wide spread of ratios for everything from coaling through a truck stop to cruising at highway speed with a full load behind. These transmissions are robust and well designed, but after decades of sitting without use, the internals had suffered from the same corrosion and oil degradation that had affected every other system on the truck. We stripped it completely, cleaned every component, inspected every gear and shaft and bearing and synchro ring, and rebuilt it with new bearings throughout and new seals at every output. The chef forks were measured and found to be within spec. The splitter mechanism was serviced and adjusted. The finished transmission shifted cleanly and precisely through every ratio and every split, which was exactly what it needed to do. The rear differentials, there are two of them on a truck of this configuration, the tandem drive axles that give the heavy combination its traction, and its ability to handle the enormous torque of the big diesel engine, were similarly stripped, inspected, and rebuilt. The crown wheel and pinion on each diff were measured and found to be within acceptable limits for continued service. New bearings, new seals, new oil, and they were done. The air brake system on a truck of this class is considerably more complex than the hydraulic systems found on lighter vehicles, and the work required to bring it back to a safe and reliable operating condition was correspondingly more extensive. The brake chambers at every wheel position were inspected. Several were found to have corroded internally beyond safe service and were replaced with new units. The slack adjusters were inspected and serviced. The brake shoes and drums at each axle position were inspected. The drums were found to be within acceptable limits and were refaced to give the new friction material a clean surface to work against. New brake shoes with quality friction material were fitted throughout. The entire air system was pressure tested to verify the integrity of every line and fitting before the truck was moved under its own power for the first time. The steering system on a truck of this size operates at forces that dwarf those in any passenger vehicle, and the consequences of a steering failure at highway speed with a full load are too terrible to contemplate. We approached the steering system rebuilt with the seriousness it deserved. The power steering pump was rebuilt with new seals and valves. The steering box was rebuilt and adjusted to give the correct feel and return to center behavior. The drag link and tie rod ends were all replaced with new components, and the kingpins and associated bushes were renewed throughout. When the steering was complete and correctly adjusted, this old Kenworth tracked straight and true and responded to the wheel with the kind of precision that makes driving a truck of this size a pleasure rather than a battle. The cab restoration was the most visible and the most technically demanding part of the entire project, and it is the part that attracted the most attention from everyone who visited the workshop during the course of the restoration. To understand why, you need to understand what we were starting with: a cab that had been exposed to the Australian climate for 2 decades or more, that had been sitting open to the sun and the rain and the dust and the wildlife for all of that time, that had accumulated corrosion on every external surface and deterioration on every internal surface, and that needed to be transformed into something worthy of the beautiful green paint and the gleaming chrome that we had planned for the finished truck. We stripped the cab completely before touching anything else. Every piece of glass, every rubber seal, every piece of trim, every instrument, every piece of wiring, every component that could be removed was removed until we had a bare metal shell that we could see and assess and work on from every angle. The metal work assessment on the bare shell was sobering. There was rust damage in most of the expected locations: the lower sections of the doors, the cab floor, the corners where water had collected and sat. But there was also rust in some less expected locations, including behind some of the exterior trim pieces, where trapped moisture had been working on the metal unseen for years. Every area of rut was cut out and replaced with new metal, fabricated where patch panels were not available and fitted where they were. The cab floor was replaced in sections where it had corroded through. The all lower sections were repaired with fabricated patches that matched the original profile. The corners were rebuilt. And through all of this cutting and welding and grinding and fitting, the distinctive shape of that Kenworth cab, that proud, square-jawed, purposeful shape that is unlike any other truck cab ever built, gradually emerged from the rust and the damaged metal, clean and true and ready for the next stage. The paint preparation process on a cab of this size is a significant undertaking, and on this particular cab, given the amount of metalwork that had been done, it was even more involved than usual. Every welded area needed to be feathered and primed and flattened before the surface could be considered uniform. Every panel needed to be assessed for straightness and flatness, with any remaining imperfections addressed with the thinnest possible skim of body filler that was then guide coated and block sanded to a standard that would allow the final paint to show the work to its best advantage. High build primer went on in multiple coats, each coat guide coated and sanded before the next was applied. Seam sealer was applied and tooled smooth at every joint and repair. The preparation took longer than the painting itself, which is exactly as it should be. The preparation is everything in a high quality paint job, and you cannot shortcut it without paying the price in the quality of the final result. The color we chose for this Kenworth was a deep, rich forest green, the kind of deep, jewel-like green that catches the light differently depending on the angle you view it from. It looks almost black in shadow and then blazes with depth and richness when the sun hits it directly. It is a color with a long tradition in Australian heavy transport, associated with quality and professionalism and the kind of operator who takes pride in their equipment. And on this Kenworth, it was exactly right. The paint was applied in multiple coats of color over the correctly prepared primer. Each coat flashed off properly before the next was applied, followed by clear coat that was then machine polished to a depth and gloss that had everyone who saw the finished cab stopping to look at their reflection in the panels. The chrome on a Kenworth of this vintage is not a decoration. It is a statement, a declaration of pride and craftsmanship that is integral to the character and the presence of the truck in a way that nothing else quite replaces. The exhaust stacks, the sun visor, the bumper assembly, the grills, the rounds, the mirror arms, the various trim pieces the Kenworth fitted to their trucks in this era. All of it needed to be either restored or replaced, and the decision on each piece was made based on the condition of the original and the availability of reproduction components. Where the originals were recoverable, they went to our chrome specialist for the full triple plating process, copper, nickel, chrome, that produces the deepest and most durable chrome finish available. Where originals were beyond recovery, new reproduction components were sourced. The finished chrome fitted to the painted cab produced the kind of visual impact that stopped traffic. Literally, when we first moved the completed truck out of the workshop, cars slowed down and drivers wound their windows down to look. The interior of a truck cab is a driver's workplace, the place where they spend days and sometimes weeks at a stretch, where they eat and sleep and rest between runs, where the quality of the environment has a direct impact on their comfort and their safety and their ability to do their job well. We approached the interior restoration with that understanding firmly in mind, and we brought the same level of care and craftsmanship to the inside of the cab that we had applied to the outside. The seat was rebuilt with new foam and upholstered in a period-correct material. The dashboard was stripped back to bare metal, repaired and repainted. Every instrument in the cluster was either rebuilt or replaced. The speedometer, the tachometer, the air pressure gauges, the temperature and oil pressure gauges, the voltmeter, all working correctly and calibrated to read accurately. The headliner was replaced with new material. The bunk area in the sleeper section was completely rebuilt, new foam, new covering, new storage solutions that replicated the original layout. New glass went into every opening, sealed with new rubber all round. The floor covering was replaced with heavy-duty material that would stand up to the kind of boots that truck drivers wear. And when the interior was complete, it had the feel of a cab that had been used but cared for. Exactly the character we had aimed for. Professional and functional and comfortable, with the kind of attention to detail that told you the person who put it together understood what a truck driver's life is actually like and respected it. The electrical system was completely replaced from battery to tail light, because on a truck of this age, after this amount of exposure and neglect, there was simply no safe or sensible alternative. Modern wire with quality insulation was used throughout, loomed in period-correct style and routed according to the original design intent, with modern connectors at every junction that would resist corrosion and maintain the integrity of the circuit over the kind of service life that a well-maintained truck represents. Every light position was refitted with new lamps, the headlights, the marker lights, the clearance lights that run along the top of the cab and give this style of Kenworth its distinctive profile at night, the reversing lights, the brake lights, the turn signals. A new battery was fitted in the correct location, and the complete system was tested and verified before the truck was moved. The tires and wheels were the final major item before the truck could be declared complete and ready for road. A set of correctly profiled tires was sourced and fitted to the refurbished wheels, and with those fitted and inflated to the correct pressure, the truck sat at the correct height and attitude for the first time in decades, and the transformation from the flat-tiered, settled into the ground ruin we had started with was so dramatic that even those of us who had been present for every step of the journey found it remarkable. The running in process for a freshly rebuilt diesel engine of this size requires patience and discipline that can be difficult to maintain when what you really want to do is put your foot down and hear what that engine can do when it is properly encouraged. But we did it correctly, careful, controlled running with gradually increasing loads, monitoring oil pressure and temperature constantly, checking for leaks at every stop, changing the oil at the first service interval, and inspecting the filter for any debris that might indicate a problem with the newly rebuilt internal components. By the end of the running-in period, the engine was pulling smoothly and strongly, and the temperature and pressure readings were exactly where they needed to be, and the gearbox was shifting with the kind of slick precision that tells you everything inside is correctly adjusted and properly lubricated. Standing back and looking at this truck when it was finished, this old Kenworth that had been rusting in the Australian outback for 20-odd years, that had been written off by everyone who had ever walked past it and kept walking, that had sat there in the dirt and the heat accumulating rust and losing pieces of itself to time and weather and neglect, and seeing what it had become through months of skilled and dedicated work, was one of those moments that reminds you with absolute clarity why this work matters and why it will always matter no matter how much the world around it changes. That dark green paint, glowing with depth and knife, those chrome stacks, catching the afternoon sun and throwing it back in every direction. The sound of that big diesel at idle, patient and powerful and completely at ease with itself. The whole truck sitting square and level on properly inflated tires, the cab up high and proud the way a Kenworth is supposed to sit. Everything in its place and everything working correctly. This is what we do this for. This is why we get up in the morning and put our overalls on and go to the workshop and spend our days dealing with rust and corrosion and seized bolts and corroded wiring and all the other challenges that come with bringing old machines back to life. Because at the end of it all, there is that moment, that extraordinary, irreplaceable moment when you stand back and look at what your hands and your skills and your commitment have created, and you understand that you have done something that will outlast you. Something that will go on turning heads and starting conversations and connecting people to a piece of history that might otherwise have been lost forever. And in doing that, you have given back to the world something of genuine and lasting value, something that deserves to exist. And now, because of the work done in this workshop by this team over these months, actually does.